Okay, so informally, people often say something is JSON if it's a string whose content is something that you could have typed into Firebug or you could have put in a JavaScript file. And that is still sometimes used. In particular, it's used for applications like the Google Chrome developer tools or Firebug. Let me just take a break and jump and look at Firebug one more time. So here's one of the very first examples we did in Firebug at the beginning of this video series. We typed in a function definition, we clicked run, and then we tried it out. Square of 5 to see if we got 25. Well, it turns out you can write something exactly like this yourself in a normal web page. This is a normal web page. You can do it yourself. So this section down at the bottom here is actually a big text area. Text areas are something supported by HTML. And then this little button here has a JavaScript code attached to it that looks for a click. And it's called an event handler. When it gets a click, it reads the value of the text area. Because it might have anonymous objects in it, it can put parentheses around it. It passes it to eval and it inserts the result up at the top. You can write this yourself. In fact, I was teaching a graduate level course on web applications at Johns Hopkins University, and I used to assign a programming project where students made a little miniature version of Firebug that ran in any random web browser portably. And it was not hard. It could be done in an easy 1 week exercise. Now, Firebug, of course, does a lot more things than just that, but reading some code from the end user, evaluating it in JavaScript, and printing out the result is something that you can do yourself. Okay, fine. I can use eval if I'm going to do a read eval print loop. In other words, read something from the user, evaluate it, print it out, go back and do it again, which is what Firebug does. But the fact is you don't do that very often. Whereas you read data from the server, interpret it, insert some results in the page based on it all the time. We're going to spend several lectures on this in jQuery. And so eval is kind of old-fashioned and out of date. You use eval for the very general purpose applications like Firebug, but you don't tend to use eval in modern applications for data from the server. Now, older applications did. In raw JavaScript applications that didn't use a library like jQuery, people used eval because JSON.parse wasn't part of the language until a couple of years ago. And so early web applications that did use JavaScript had no choice. And jQuery itself used eval internally up until version 1.3 when JSON.parse was well established and standardized. And many other JavaScript libraries other than jQuery still use eval today internally. But it's almost universally agreed that it's a better practice to use strict JSON, which I'll discuss shortly, and JSON.parse, which is what jQuery, which we'll cover later, uses internally. So to recap, eval is used mostly for more limited and general purpose applications like building a miniature version of Firebug yourself, making an interpreter loop, whereas strict JSON and JSON.parse is used primarily for web applications nowadays. Okay, so if you have an object literal, an anonymous object, and you want it directly in JavaScript, you don't have to worry about any of this stuff. You just type it in. That's what we did in the previous section. There's no worry about eval or JSON.parse. You don't have to put it in a string. You just type it in and you've got a value. Just remember that there are commas in between the pairs, but no comma at the end after the last pair. The only time we have to worry about these funny issues is if we're getting JSON from a string. Why would you get JSON from a string? Well, it might be when you're reading it from the end user. That's what Firebug does. But much more commonly is when we're getting data from the server, which is something we'll get to in a few sections. And so if the string that's coming from the server is not in strict JSON, then you have to surround it in parentheses and pass it to eval. But if it is strict JSON, you don't have to put any parentheses around it, and you just pass it directly to JSON.parse. Now, we're going to be using jQuery. jQuery does this internally, and so we're not going to have to do it ourselves, but nevertheless, this is what jQuery does. And I want to reiterate that the approach with strict JSON and JSON.parse, or using a library like jQuery that uses JSON.parse internally and requires the data to be in strict JSON format, is strongly preferred in recent applications. So I said, well, it has to be strict JSON. Well, what do you mean by strict JSON? The kind of informal idea of JSON, something that you can use in eval, is a string whose content looks like anything you could have typed into JavaScript. In strict JSON, it's a much more restricted subset. You have an object property, and the property name itself is in double quotes. We don't normally put double quotes around the property name, only around the property value if it's a string. We didn't say double quotes first name colon Polly. We said first name colon Polly. But technically speaking, property names are allowed to have special characters in them like spaces and colons. And that forces you to enclose them in double quotes. Now, normally you just avoid those and you don't bother with double quotes, but it's legal. And since it's legal for JSON, they said, look, we don't know what special characters are going to be in the property name. So we'll just say you always put it in double quotes. And furthermore, JSON says, strings could, in real JavaScript, be in single quotes or double quotes, but I want to make it easier to format, easier to parse. You have to be in double quotes. So it's a much more restricted format. It's not any random piece of JavaScript code. It's an anonymous object or an array where object property names are enclosed in quotes and strings use double quotes. And if you violate this rule, it'll work with eval, but it will not work with JSON.parse. It will not work with jQuery, and you'll get an error instead. Now, if you look at JSON.org and you look at the specification, it says that the server should also label the data that's coming from the server with this MIME type. In fact, almost no server actually labels it that way, and none of the major libraries, including jQuery, actually enforce this. So the string that comes from the server, it doesn't matter what the server labels as its MIME type, but it does matter what the format is. Okay, so eval can parse anything. However, if it's an object literal, and you're treating curly braces as part of an object literal rather than enclosing statements, you have to put parentheses around the outside of the string before you pass it to eval. But JSON.parse can only parse strict JSON. It's much more limited. However, you don't have to put in extra parentheses. It's much more portable. Lots and lots of languages know how to produce strict JSON. There's libraries in Java, there's libraries in C#, there's libraries in Ruby, there's libraries in Python, and so forth. And it's more secure. You don't have to worry about the server data slipping you in a function that you're going to accidentally run that's going to compromise the integrity of the page. I also want to point out that there's a method called JSON.stringify for sending data the other way. You have some code already in JavaScript. In your normal JavaScript code, you don't follow the rules of JSON. It's more inconvenient. It's only the data from the server. But so you have a normal JavaScript object in JavaScript, and now you want to send it to the server, you can call JSON.stringify. Now, normally, you send simple data to the server, and you get complicated data back. So it's very common to use JSON.parse. Data coming from the server is complex, and not as common to use JSON.stringify. Data to the server is usually much simpler. Okay, so here's a quick example. I made a string that contains an object literal inside the string, and it follows the rules of strict JSON. The property name is enclosed in quotes, and the value that's a string uses double quotes, not single quotes. So that string, the content of that string, is strict JSON. If I wanted to evaluate it with JSON.parse, I just pass it directly. And now P1 is a real object. It's as if I had said P1 equals that thing directly. But if I'm going to pass to eval, I would have to put parentheses around it first.